10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 323. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 323 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. If you are new to the show, welcome in. We are so happy to have you here. And for all of our returning listeners, welcome back. This week we are going to continue with our series on the playing of Charlie Parker, and we're going to get into another harmonic device that he uses, which is enclosures, and more specifically, a very particular way that he likes to use enclosures all over his playing. So of course, before we jump into the episode, just wanted to remind you this is a listener-supported podcast, which means that we do not do advertisements on the show, except for this short one to let you know how you can support the show each and every month in the form of a small donation, and that really keeps us going. And you get a bunch of jazz education materials in return, including a PDF for every episode and audio examples. So we use the Patreon platform, and to find that and find out all the information about supporting the show, go to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, and that will bring you over, give you all the info, and allow you to get signed up for instant access. So we've got some new patrons to give a shout out to. Thank you to our new $5 patrons. Thank you to Martone, Thomas, John, and Kevin. And thank you to our new $3 patrons, Kevin, Mateo, Daniel, and Maria. Thank you guys so much for becoming a part of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson family. And to everybody over there that's been supporting us for any period of time, thank you. We could not do this show without you. So again, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, get yourself signed up today. All right, so last week we talked about Charlie Parker's use, a particular use of the 16th note triplet, and we went over a little formula on how you can start using that in your own playing. This week we're going to look at another device. It has to do with enclosures, but it's a really particular form of an enclosure that Charlie Parker absolutely loves that you can start using in your playing right away. So pull out your PDF and look at the examples. We've got 3 to go through. We're going to talk about what makes these lines tick. Okay, so before we actually jump into the nitty-gritty of the lines, I want to talk about where is the best place to use an enclosure, and also the way that Charlie Parker is thinking, or at least the way I think that he's thinking. That made no sense, but let's go with it. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at some 2-5-1s, and Charlie Parker is always choosing as the first note over the 1 chord, the spot where he has the resolution of his line, he's thinking about a target note. So that's an important concept. We need to think about the target note and then base the enclosure off of that. The notes in the enclosure are always going to lead to the target note. So if you look at your PDF, I've got 3 to 4 color-coded notes, and that signifies the enclosure. And then the note after the last red note is the target note. So in example number 1, the target note is the 5th of the 1 chord. In example number 2, the target note is the 3rd of the 1 chord. And then in example number 3, the target note again is the 5th of the goal chord. That's where he's resolving everything. So as long as you understand that concept, that there is in fact a target note, then you can work backward and come up with your enclosure in this very specific way. So now let's jump into the very specific use case that Charlie Parker plays all the time. This is all over the Omnibook and all over the playing of Charlie Parker. So he uses a 3-note enclosure. And the pattern of this enclosure goes above and then 2 notes below. Okay, so it's always 1 note above, 2 notes below. And now let's dive into that a little bit deeper. So he's playing the note above on the and of 3, and then the 2 notes below are always chromatically leading to that target note. So the formula for this particular enclosure that Charlie Parker loves is a half step above the target note, a whole step below the target note, moving up a half step to a half step below the target note to the target note. So half step above, whole step below, half step below, target note. And that is how you can start to come up with these yourself, by using that exact formula. So let's dive into the examples. So let's check out example number 1. So you can see on the and of 3 in the second measure of that particular example, we follow that exact formula. Half step above the concert A, a whole step below the concert A, then moving chromatically up on the and of 4 till you're a half step below the target note, and then boom, right on 1, we hit that target note of the concert A. So there it is in action, and I think you can hear it adds a lot of gravity pushing into the target note. It really makes us want to hear that target note, and it frames it in such a way that's going to sound absolutely wonderful once we hit that target on beat 1. All right, let's go on to example number 2. So again, we see the exact same thing. On the and of 3, we're a half step above that concert D. Then we move to a whole step below, up a half step, boom, target note right on beat 1. And you could hear he's framed it in a much different way, right? Like the phrase before it is completely different, but we still have the presence of that one particular enclosure on the starting on the and of 3. All right, let's take a look at our last example. And in this one, it's just a tiny bit different because I'm thinking that he actually starts it on beat 3, but there's a repeated note. So what he does in this example is on beat 3, he's a whole step below the target note. Then he jumps to that half step above, whole step below, half step below, target. So in this one, he's just lengthening that enclosure a little bit by actually starting on the whole step below and then beginning that familiar process that we're used to. So here's example number 3. So I'm hoping that you're starting to see how you can, again, use this kind of formula of a 3-note enclosure. And if you're new to enclosures, this is a great place to start because it's not that complicated. It's only 3 notes. And once you figure out your target note, you can figure out the 3 notes that need to come before it following that exact guide. So what I would like you to do is write a couple of 2-5-1 lines and start with the target note. So maybe pick the 5th over the 1 chord. Start with that, work your way backward, put those 3 notes in there, and then come up with the rest of the line based off of the knowledge that you want to end it with that very specific enclosure. Now, I want to get a little bit deeper here at the end of the episode and just give you something to think about, all right? So on examples 2 and 3, we can actually extrapolate the fact that the entire measure before the target note is a big, long enclosure, right? So what I want you to notice is in example 2, measure 2, do you notice that the entire measure is really leading us toward that target note in the 3rd measure? So let's look at what he's doing. He's playing 2 notes on beat 1 that are above the target note. Then he's jumping down, playing 2 notes below the target note. Then on beat 3, we get another note below the target note. And then we see that enclosure starting on the and of 3 that we had just talked about. So really, you could think about the entire measure being a big, long enclosure. I want you to listen to example number 2 through that lens really quickly. So this might not be practical for you at this point to like think about an entire measure, right? But I think what this does is it really emphasizes the fact that the target note is so important. And really, your 5-chord measure in a 2-5-1 should really be in service of the target note that lands on beat 1 of the resolution point. Okay, so if your head is swimming right now and you're like, this is too much, don't worry about it. Just do the little work on the little 3-note enclosure that we've been talking about. But if you want to start thinking at a little bit of a higher level, this is actually a really cool thing to start thinking about. How can I construct my lines so that the target note is what everything is pushing toward? And in bebop, this is a huge, huge concept. So just have that swimming around in the back of your mind there, okay? Let me know if you have any questions. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Start using that 3-note enclosure in your own playing. Start coming up with some of your own lines, investigating how you can use it effectively, and ultimately how you can put it into your playing, all right? Remember to grab your PDF, 10minutejazzlesson.com. Click on one of the Patreon banners. As always, hope everybody's staying safe and healthy out there, and we will see you next week with another episode. Have a good one, everybody. Bye.